Why would a country that claims it has one of the largest amounts of oil in the world underneath its own soil spend all of its time attempting to steal everybody else's? The United States of America is the largest single consumer of oil on the planet. It's not even close. The US consumes more oil in a year than the entirety of the European Union and Russia combined. And what I'm about to show you, I believe, is evidence the United States is about to run out of oil completely. I came to this conclusion after a conversation with the wife a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about how the way the US treats countries with large reserves of oil. And she asked me, how much oil does the US actually have? America says it has loads of oil. Not only do they have proven oil reserves of 43.8 billion barrels, plus billions of barrels in stock, but the Energy Information Administration in the US estimates it also has an extra 198 billion barrels or so underneath its soil that it just hasn't found yet. If that's the case, why does America insist on trying to steal everyone else's? Then you look at the wording of it. The 198 billion barrels are, quote, undiscovered, technically recoverable. In other words, they think it might be there, but they don't really know where, and even if they find it someday, they might not be able to get at it. I'm guessing they stopped looking when they realised the oil is mostly shale oil. And, quote, shale oil requires mining and energy-intensive refining processes. It's a substantially dirtier energy source than conventional liquid oil. Not a good idea to be going after that while at the same time declaring you care so much about the environment and climate change, is it? So, although the EIA in the US says it has about 240 billion barrels of oil underneath its own territory, nearly 200 billion of that not only hasn't been found yet, but they don't know whether they could extract it even if they found it, and the chances are, even if they can, it will be energy intensive and absolutely awful for the environment. No wonder United States foreign policy always seems to be concentrated on oil-rich countries. They're running out of it. Here are the top 10 oil countries with the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Notice I said proven here, not undiscovered and technically recoverable. The US is all the way down there at number 10, but let's take a look at the others and study how the US treats them. Number 1 is Venezuela. Between 2007 and 2015, the proven oil reserves in Venezuela tripled from 100 billion barrels to about 300 billion barrels of oil. And how has the US treated Venezuela in that time? Well, they've attempted several regime change coups, including one which was almost comical until you realise it's the people of Venezuela who ended up suffering the most as a result. The United States, after failing in coup attempts in Venezuela the entirety of this century, along with the UK, declared Juan Guaido president, despite the fact that not a single Venezuelan had ever voted for him to be their leader, and only 18% had ever heard of him until that point. Regardless, the US and UK cited Maduro's low approval rating as the reason that Juan Guaido was now Venezuelan president. Using that as justification for it, the UK even withheld £1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold they had stored in the Bank of England, saying it's Guaido's decision on how to use the gold. Just to put the cherry on top of how ridiculous this decision was, President Macron's approval rating in France was lower at the time, but the US wasn't declaring Marine Le Pen president, were they? There's been further regime change attempts since then, and in 2022 former US Special Forces soldiers were captured while trying to land on a beach in Venezuela. They confessed on camera to being part of a wider plot to capture and kidnap Venezuelan President Maduro. And just recently, after all those multiple failed coup attempts, the US under the Biden administration are attempting to negotiate a deal for a resumption in oil trade from Venezuela. However, they're dealing with President Maduro, not Juan Guaido. Something Juan Guaido is not happy about at all. He's still under the impression he's the president of Venezuela. After all, the US haven't told him any different. And the UK are still holding on to Venezuela's gold for the very reason that they say Juan Guaido's the president, not Maduro. But it's Maduro who's being dealt with here. Personally, I don't think the UK have that gold. I think we sold it to cash4gold.com to help pay for Brexit, but that's another theory. My point is, if the US has so much oil, why has it been so set on stealing Venezuela's oil for the entirety of this century? And why is Biden fist-bumping Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, who have the second largest proven oil reserves in the world? If the US has enough oil, why would they try striking deals with a nation Biden once said had, quote, no redeeming social value, and promised on the campaign trail when he was campaigning to be president to turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah? Relations soured between the two countries, of course, after the murder and dismemberment of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Saudis took offence when the West blamed and condemned them for the heinous crime of killing a journalist. And if you look at things from their point of view, however difficult and uncomfortable that may be, you can start to see why. The US, according to the testimony of 30 ex and current intelligence officials, were not that long ago drawing up plans to kidnap and kill a journalist themselves in the centre of London, a man named Julian Assange. You might know of him. How can they clutch pearls or point fingers at the Saudis knowing that? Anyway, Khashoggi's murder signalled the end of the US-Saudi relations, and many people will say, signalled the end of the petrodollar with it. For if global oil exports are not paid for in dollars, the days of the dollar as the world's reserve currency are numbered. With oil exports around the world in dollars, the United States has incredible power. Without that, it becomes a paper tiger. Most recently, the Saudis, along with the rest of the OPEC plus oil-rich nations in the world, have agreed to reduce production, and that pushes up the global price of oil. High oil prices are really bad for American presidents. Really bad. The Saudis have even claimed Biden wanted them to delay the decision on limiting oil until after the US midterms this year, such as the impact high oil prices would have on the electorate. US foreign policy towards other oil-rich nations in the world tell a similar story. Iran and Iraq have been in America's crosshairs since forever, of course. You don't need me to go on about the history of those two countries here. And many people believe the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya came about because he had plans to create an African currency backed by gold and export oil in dinars rather than dollars. Next thing you know...
We came, we saw, he died.
Did you know the United States is currently illegally occupying about a third of Syria and stealing over 80% of its daily oil production? The media don't tell people about that, do they? And why would it be doing that if it wasn't running out of oil in the first place? Stealing another country's oil is not just illegal according to international law, it's bloody dangerous and expensive. Now, the largest supplier of oil to the United States is Canada next door. And even that begs the question, if the US has enough oil, why feel the need to build pipelines all the way from the Alberta tar sands in Canada, poisoning the water and destroying Native American land along the way? Did you know the US hasn't built a major oil refinery in 50 years? Don't you find that strange? And why hasn't the US been improving its crumbling infrastructure? Something we know from the way the IMF works in other countries is needed if you're going to be extracting large amounts of resources from underneath your territory in the near future. Doesn't it make sense to assume the US doesn't have the oil it says it does? Doesn't that one assumption make everything else the US has been doing and is doing around the world right now make sense? Well, that thought, with data surrounding the oil the US actually has in stock, sitting in the petroleum reserve in a yard somewhere, and the bleak situation becomes even bleaker. In January this year, reports surfaced America's stocks of oil had been depleted by 19%. By April, reports were the oil reserves had reduced by as much as 40%. And most recent reports are US stocks of oil are at their lowest for 4 decades. It's running out fast, especially considering they're having to sell off reserves they do have in huge amounts to other countries to keep the global price low, even if that means selling oil reserves to their adversaries in China. The US is not just running out of oil. It can't produce it fast enough. It's having to sell the oil it has in stock to its supposed enemies to keep the price low, and has pissed off just about every other country in the world with the oil reserves that could solve America's problem. President Biden and the US administration have been using the highest shelf when it comes to language of war, haven't they? Perhaps running out of oil has something to do with that. For if the US has no oil and it's no longer traded globally in dollars, the days of the dollar as the world's reserve currency come to an end. And with it, the 1,000 or so military bases the US has around the world become an expensive liability rather than a military asset. Earlier this year, the great Chris Hedges wrote this: "Once the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, the dollar will precipitously drop in value, perhaps as much as by 2/3, as the pound sterling did when the British currency was abandoned as the world's reserve currency in the 1950s. He goes on to say this: "The US domination of the world economy after 75 years is over. It is not coming back. We manufacture little short of weapons. Our economy is a mirage built on unsustainable levels of debt. The pillage orchestrated by the capitalist elites and corporations has hollowed the country out from the inside, leaving the infrastructure decayed, democratic institutions moribund, and at least half the population struggling at subsistence level." The United States is running out of oil. That's why it's doing such crazy things around the world, and has been doing increasingly for the last few years especially. Did you know Russia, by the way, while not having the largest amount of oil in the world, actually produces almost as much as the United States does on a daily basis? Interesting, that is, isn't it? If the United States was to gain control of that, it would solve a lot of their problems, wouldn't it? They share a border, you know, the United States and Russia. America is running out of oil. That's why it's been so belligerent towards every oil-rich country on the planet in the last few years that won't bend to its will. Stop it, Uncle Sam. If you've got as much oil underneath your feet as you say you have, dig that up instead. Concentrate on that. Stop trying to steal everybody else's. And maybe give your own people healthcare and some basic human rights too. There's a good chap.